So a last slide here in video, sort of taking a deep dive onto some of our fatty acids. So just reviewing sort of where we've been, we've talked about the different kinds of fatty acids from saturated to the different types of mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. We talked about how their structure affords function and whether we call them a fat or an oil when we make them into triglycerides. And then our last slide really talked about where we find these in our dietary world, whether they're saturated fats from animal sources, unsaturated fats from plant sources, or trans fats that generally are artificially produced and we want to do our best to avoid. So last slide here in video to sort of talk about our omega fats, right? And highlighting sort of the difference between some terms that we've used in the course. The first word or term is necessary, and then essential. Now, while in the English language we might use these terms interchangeably, biochemically they're very different. When I use the word necessary, this means that our body needs this metabolite or this biological molecule to function. Examples of things that are necessary are glucose and omega-3 fatty acids, right? When we talk about something being essential, that's different. So something that is essential is not only needed, but we cannot produce it. So using those two examples again, glucose and omega-3 fatty acids are both necessary in our body, but only one of them is essential. We have the ability to make our own glucose in our body, so glucose is not considered an essential nutrient. Omega-3s are. We cannot make that terminal double bond in those fatty acids, so we need to consume them from our diet. So making sure we understand the difference between the terms necessary and essential. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a deep dive then on thinking about omega-3 versus omega-6 fatty acids. So some of this content we've probably already talked about, but omega-3 fatty acids refer to the position of the double bond that we have as we come in from sort of the back end of our fatty acid. So coming in from this terminal methyl group here, 3 carbons in, we're going to have our first double bond. Omega-6 fatty acids have that first double bond 6 carbons in from the end. So that's where those names come from. Remembering that omega refers to, that's the last letter in the Greek alphabet. So we're talking about how many carbon atoms in from the end of the molecule do we have our double bond. Okay, I'm going to leave a little space in the middle here because one of the things that we will talk about biologically is what's an important ratio to have of these different classes of fats in our body, the ratio between omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. I will tell you this is probably an important metric to sort of get. You can get it from blood work. It's not your standard blood work panel, but you can get something called an omega index, and it's going to give you your ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids in your body. So we'll close out looking at sort of what those ratios are from an ideal sense, a reality sense, like what can we realistically get to in the food world that we have today, and unfortunately where most people lie with the standard American diet or the SAD diet. So hopefully you remember we talked briefly about omega-3 fatty acids before. Omega-3 fatty acids are anti-inflammatory. Contrast that to omega-6 fatty acids, which are pro-inflammatory. Now you might say, well, I thought inflammation was bad, Dr. Perini. Remember, inflammation is not bad. Chronic inflammation is problematic, but we need to have omega-6 fatty acids to induce inflammation at times where we need an inflammatory process. But we also need to have an anti-inflammatory response. We need to have times where we sort of turn off that inflammatory response. And having the ability to toggle inflammation on and off is key. Chronic inflammation is what is problematic. Let's talk about where we find some of these sources. A great source for omega-3s is salmon, and I will highlight that it should be wild salmon. And here's why. Salmon by itself doesn't have omega-3s. Just like we are unable to produce omega-3s, salmon themselves can't produce omega-3s. Here's where salmon get their omega-3s. They consume algae, specifically something called chlorella, or they consume little crustaceans called krill. Both the algae, well, actually, the algae is really what makes these omega-3 fatty acids. The algae is consumed by the krill. The salmon consume the krill, and we, in consuming the salmon, are going to be able to get those omega-3 fatty acids, right? People may talk about, oh, I take a krill oil supplement as a way to get my omega-3s. That's awesome. Again, we generally are getting them first from the algae that are able to produce them. Now, why I say wild salmon is if you have any sort of factory farmed meat, they generally are not consuming their natural diet, right? So wild salmon may be actually fed grain or other things as a food source that will cause them to grow and fatten them up. Same thing with factory farmed cattle and so forth. You want to be thinking about consuming protein sources that as much as possible are produced with their natural food source. That's going to be the healthiest for you. All right, so that's where we can get some of our omega-3s. Our omega-6s, a lot of our seed oils are omega-6s. And I don't think, highlight this on our last slide, but if you look at the bottle of oil that we have down here for omega-6s, we've got canola oils. Now, people may be thinking, oh, canola oil, really rich in omega fats. Yes, but it's very rich in omega-6s, which are the pro-inflammatory fatty acids. So again, that's not necessarily the best. These seed oils tend to be very low in cost, right? So we're going to see a lot of oils that are used for food production, for cooking, and so forth. But I want to highlight that anytime you are using an oil for cooking that is unsaturated, the problem is it is easily oxidized, and heat, unfortunately, does a lot to facilitate that oxidation process, and that even makes them more pro-inflammatory. We talked about this as if you have seed oils that are sort of sitting in your pantry, right? And if they sit there for too long, if you sort of take them out and you might smell them, they sort of have a rancid smell. Highlighting, if you were to take, any oil and try to consume it, it should really not have a smell. Now, things like peanut oil or coconut oil, they may actually smell like their source. But in general, oils should not have a strong smell to them. If they do, they've been oxidized, they're rancid, and you should not consume them. Okay? I'm going to highlight here too that if you want to talk about oils that you should cook with, you should cook with oils that are saturated fats because they are very stable to heat. Butter is a great oil to cook with. Coconut oil is a great oil to cook with. Avocado oil, another really good oil to cook with. Olive oil, not great for cooking. It's a very sensitive oil to oxidation. So you really want to be using it cold, either as salad dressings or for dipping or things like that. Really don't want to be cooking at high temperatures with olive oil. Okay, last little piece here, and then we'll get to this section down at the bottom. Ideally, what would a great ratio be for your omega-3s to your omega-6s? 1-to-1, right? You have just as much anti-inflammatory as you do pro-inflammatory fatty acids in your body. Very rare to be able to achieve that in today's dietary space. So the reality is if you could get to a 4-to-1 ratio between omega-6s to omega-3s, you're in great shape from a metabolic health standpoint. Now, unfortunately, the standard American diet has it that most people probably have about a 20-fold excess of these pro-inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids in their body, right? Not ideal. The last piece I want to talk about is when we look at these essential omega-3 fatty acids, we tend to see three ones that are generally referred to by their acronyms, ALA, EPA, and DHA, sort of referring to them in order here. The main differences that we have between them is they increase by 2 carbon atoms. So this is C18, this is C20, this is C22. Okay, so highlighting what we sort of have here. This guy is C18, C20, C22, and we increase in the number of double bonds that we have. So we've got 3 double bonds. I'm going to put this in parentheses here. 3 double bonds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 double bonds that we have here. and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 double bonds that we have there. Okay, so what we're going to see is we have an increase in the size as well as the number of double bonds. Now, I will highlight too that when we talk about all of these fatty acids, one of the things that we'll spend a good bit of time sort of talking about when we learn about vitamins is which of these are the bioavailable form or the bioactive form. So I will highlight here that it's really the C20 and the C22 fatty acids that are the bioavailable forms that are the essential omega-3s that we need. So these guys are the bioavailable. I cannot spell bioavailable. Bioavailable. So when we talk about, for example, we talked about folic acid, right? And we talked about that in the context of MTHFR. And MTHFR is required to convert folic acid into 5-methylfolate. 5-methylfolate is the bioavailable form of vitamin B9. Right? So if you want to talk about the importance of having the bioavailable form of a vitamin or a nutrient, when we're talking about our omega-3s, it's really EPA and DHA that are the bioavailable forms. So we get C18 omega-3s. We can get these from seed oils. And truthfully, we do have the ability to sort of do this conversion, okay? But very low efficiency of this conversion, okay? And highlighting what that conversion is we make them longer, and then we increase the number of double bonds. But we are horribly inefficient in doing this conversion process, and the equivalent or the net outcome is that these become essential fatty acids. So the C20 and C22 fatty acids are essential because we cannot make them from the C18 sort of precursor. So last little thing here is just to highlight what these are useful for. And so if we think about the C20 fatty acid here, this is what we call a prostaglandin precursor. So prostaglandin precursor. And prostaglandins are molecules that are used to induce pain, inflammation, and fever. And the gold star sort of molecule here is that we've got these ability to regulate the production of inflammation. Okay, and then over here, we've got DHA is an important component for brain lipids. And so you'll often see EPA and DHA listed as additives in, for example, formula, baby formula. And why that is breast milk is very rich in both EPA and DHA, obviously really important for maintaining health in a growing infant. And so if you're going to have sort of a food substitute with baby formula, you want to make sure that it is enriched in these important molecules that you need. All right, a little bit of a deep dive on our omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids.